She boarded her own airline in jeans and worn sneakers, and they walked her off it before the plane ever left the ground. Not because her ticket was wrong, because of the way she looked. What nobody on that flight knew, what nobody at that company knew, was that the woman they just escorted off owned 62% of everything they were standing on. And she wasn't angry. She was taking notes. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The morning felt ordinary enough, the kind of gray Chicago morning that smells like jet fuel and burnt coffee and the quiet anxiety of people trying to get somewhere. Terminal D at O'Hare was loud in the way airports always are, a layered noise that never quite resolves into anything distinct. Announcements bleeding over music, bleeding over conversations, bleeding over the heavy drag of roller luggage across polished floors. Amara Bennett moved through all of it without effort. She wore jeans, dark blue, plain, a loose gray sweater that had been washed so many times the collar had gone slightly soft at the edge, and a pair of white sneakers that were clean but not new. The leather backpack on her shoulder was small, the kind of bag that looked like it had traveled a lot and hadn't been replaced because it still worked fine. No designer tag, no monogram, no statement. She looked like a woman catching a flight. That was all. She had checked in the night before. She had her boarding pass loaded on her phone. She moved through security without event, stopped briefly at a coffee stand near the gate, ordered a black coffee with no flair, and found a seat at the end of a row near the window where she could see the plane being prepped on the tarmac below. She watched without seeming to watch, the way people do when they're used to observing things without announcing it. Get de 19. Aurelius Air Flight 74. Chicago to London Heathrow. Departure, 8:45 a.m. When boarding was called for first class, Amara stood, slung her backpack over one shoulder, and joined the small queue at the front of the gate. There were 7 other people ahead of her. 3 couples who wore their wealth the way some people wear cologne, heavily and without apology. A man in a charcoal suit with the tight, self-satisfied posture of someone who had never been made to wait for anything. The gate agent scanned her phone, and the reader beeped green. First class, C2A. The agent barely looked up. Amara stepped through the jet bridge and onto the aircraft. The cabin was wide-bodied. The first-class section, a quiet arrangement of large pod seats in cream and brush gray, each with its own privacy partition and a small arrangement of folded linens. It smelled like new leather and something faintly floral. Soft lighting kept everything golden despite the gray outside. Amara found her seat, row 2, window side, and placed her backpack in the overhead bin. She settled in, stretched her legs, and picked up the laminated safety card from the seat pocket the way she always did, out of habit. Not anxiety, just habit. That was when she felt it, the look. She didn't turn to find it. She had lived long enough to recognize a certain quality of attention, the kind that isn't curiosity, the kind that is measurement. The lead flight attendant was named Victoria Hale. Amara would learn that later, though she had already noticed the name badge during boarding. Victoria was tall and put together in the precise, effortful way of someone who considered their appearance part of their job performance. Her dark hair was pinned neatly. Her uniform jacket had no wrinkle in it. She smiled at every passenger who entered the first-class cabin, and the smile was warm and professional and real until it landed on Amara. Then it shifted, just slightly, not to hostility, to assessment. Victoria leaned toward the attendant beside her, a younger woman, softer in manner, who would later file a complaint about this exact moment, and said something quiet. Amara didn't hear the words, but she saw the tilt of the younger woman's head, the small, uncertain glance cast in her direction, and she understood the general shape of the sentence even without hearing it. She must be in the wrong section. 2 rows ahead and across the aisle, a man settled into his seat with the ease of someone for whom first class was simply Tuesday. Carter Wells, broad shoulders, a navy blazer, silver cufflinks that caught the light when he moved. He had the laugh of a man who had never once doubted whether the room wanted to hear it. He glanced at Amara the way people glance at something that doesn't immediately compute for them. A brief flicker of confusion, followed by the decision not to adjust his understanding, but to dismiss the inconsistency instead. "Budget passengers wandering up front," he said, not loudly, but not quietly either. It was the specific volume of a remark designed to be heard by the people around him, but to maintain plausible distance from the person it targeted. He chuckled. The man beside him gave a polite, uncomfortable smile. A woman, too, rose back, looked at Amara, and then looked quickly away. Amara turned the safety card over in her hands. She did not look up. Victoria approached a few minutes later, after the rest of the first-class passengers had boarded and the cabin had reached its pre-departure stillness. She came to Amara's row with a tablet in her hand and a smile calibrated to just below condescension. "I'm sorry to bother you," Victoria said, though her tone didn't carry much apology in it. "Would you mind showing me your boarding pass one more time?" "It was scanned at the gate," Amara said simply. "I understand. We're just doing a secondary verification for the first-class cabin." The word verification landed with a particular weight that made it clear no one else in the cabin was being asked to verify anything. Amara unlocked her phone and held up the pass. "First class, C2A, Aurelius Air." The barcode, the confirmation number, the seat assignment, all of it correct and unambiguous. Victoria looked at it with the expression of someone searching for a problem they were confident must exist. "The system may have flagged a discrepancy," she said. "It's possible there was a ticketing error on our end." "There wasn't," Amara said. "I'm not suggesting it was your fault," Victoria said, her voice dipping into something almost gentle, which was somehow worse. "These things happen. It would only take a moment. If you wouldn't mind stepping off briefly, so we can verify through the ticketing desk." "I have a confirmed first-class ticket," Amara said. Her voice was even, not raised, not tightened. "C2A. I boarded with a green scan." "Understand," Victoria said again, and the repetition of the phrase was doing a lot of work it couldn't actually support. "But I'd like to avoid any delay to the other passengers once we push back." She gestured vaguely toward the jet bridge. "It should only take a few minutes." Nearby passengers had stilled. Not all of them were watching openly, but the quality of attention in the cabin had shifted the way a room shifts when something uncomfortable is happening that no one wants to be the one to name. Carter Wells leaned his head slightly in their direction with the unhurried interest of someone watching a minor inconvenience happening to someone else. The captain's name was Daniel Brooks. He had been with Aurelius Air for 11 years. He was standing near the cockpit door when the flight attendant beside Victoria leaned over and spoke quietly to him. Something about a ticketing dispute, a passenger who needed to be re-verified. He didn't come back to look. He asked 2 questions. Is it going to delay boarding? And is she refusing to go? Victoria answered yes to the first and described the situation in a way that made the second feel implied. Daniel nodded and said, "Let's get it resolved on the ground. We're already behind on the catering window." Security arrived quickly. 2 officers who were polite in that practiced, professional way that made the politeness feel worse than if they had simply been blunt. They asked Amara to gather her bag and come with them. She looked at them for a moment. Then she reached up, opened the overhead bin, and pulled out her backpack. The cabin was quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of a plane preparing for departure, but the awkward, collective quiet of people watching something they know isn't right and choosing to let it happen anyway. Carter Wells watched her walk toward the jet bridge and said, just loud enough, "First class has standards." No one told him to stop. On the jet bridge, the air smelled like metal and morning cold. The security officers walked just behind her. Amara moved without hurry, and in that unhurried pace, she took in things that had nothing to do with being removed and everything to do with the part of her brain that never fully turned off. The catering truck was parked at the wrong angle. It would need to reposition before it could reach the service door. There were only 3 ground crew visible when there should have been 5 for a wide-body international departure. The boarding door had been left open 2 inches beyond the standard hold position, suggesting the ramp agent wasn't following the current protocol. Small things. She noted them the way other people blink. Victoria had followed them out onto the jet bridge. Not all the way, just far enough to stand at the threshold of the plane with her arms folded at her waist and her chin lifted in the manner of someone who has just successfully handled the situation. "I want you to know," Victoria said, her voice carrying the particular clarity of someone choosing their words for an audience, even when there was no audience left, "that this cabin is a particular experience. First class is for people who breathe a different kind of air." Amara stopped walking. She turned and looked at Victoria with the unhurried steadiness of someone who has no need to rush toward anything or away from anything. The security officers paused beside her. The jet bridge hummed faintly with the cold draft pulling through it. "You're right," Amara said. Her voice was quiet enough that Victoria had to hold still to hear it clearly. Air changes at higher altitudes. She held Victoria's gaze for one full, steady second. Then she turned and walked away. She did not storm. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice or reach for her phone to film anything or say anything else at all. She simply walked, straight-backed, unhurried, her worn sneakers quiet on the grated floor of the jet bridge, until the cold morning light swallowed her and the door to the aircraft closed behind her absence. The Horizon Club was on the far side of Terminal C, away from the Aurelius Air Gates, tucked behind a set of frosted glass doors that most travelers walked past without noticing. It was a private lounge with no airline branding. Deep chairs, no television screens. The coffee was served in real ceramic cups. The Wi-Fi was fast and unlocked. Amara found a corner table and set her backpack on the seat beside her. She ordered water. Then she took out her phone and scrolled briefly through her contacts to a name listed simply as M. Hale. Marcus, not Victoria, a coincidence of surnames that meant nothing and would eventually mean something only in hindsight. Marcus Hale picked up on the second ring. "You're supposed to be over the Atlantic by now," he said. "Change of plans," Amara said. "I need you to begin Phase 3. A pause. Short but textured. Marcus had been Amara's legal advisor for 9 years. He was thorough, careful, and very difficult to rattle. The pause told her he understood that Phase 3, the formal accountability trigger they had built into the audit structure and never yet used, was not being called for something small. "When?" he asked. "I'd say yesterday," she said, "but Monday morning works." She could hear him exhale slowly, the sound of a man adjusting his internal schedule in real time. "What happened?" "Nothing I didn't design the system to eventually catch." She paused, watching a family pass outside the lounge's glass wall. Two small children running ahead of their parents, dragging carry-on bags like sleds. "It's time to see what we built." Marcus said he would make the calls. She said she would send the documentation. She ended the call. For a moment, she sat still, her hands around the ceramic cup, looking at nothing in particular. Not fuming, not trembling. Thinking in the particular way she had always thought. Not in words exactly, but in structure, in shape, in the architecture of what needed to happen next, and in what order. 12 years ago, Amara Bennett had walked into a room she wasn't supposed to be in. It had been a corporate aviation investment summit in New York, the kind of event where the invitations were technically open, but the culture was firmly closed. She had been 33 years old, already successful in ways that didn't show on the surface, already carrying capital that the room didn't register because the room was looking for it in the wrong shape. She had pitched, cleanly, directly, with numbers that held up to every question they threw at her. And the questions they threw were not the questions they threw at the men around her. She hadn't walked out angry. She had walked out with a single clear thought. She was going to build the thing they refused to let her into. Not to spite them. Spite was expensive, and it burned fuel without moving forward. She built it because she could see what an airline looked like when it was structured around dignity rather than spectacle. When a measure of excellence was how every passenger felt when they sat down, not what they were wearing when they did. Aurelius Air had launched 11 years ago under the public leadership of Richard Callaway, whose name and face and long industry pedigree gave the venture a credibility the market responded to. Richard was good at the front of things, press conferences, investor dinners, the particular theater of corporate first impressions. Amara had no interest in that theater. She had structured her ownership through a chain of holding companies that were perfectly legal completely documented, and almost entirely invisible to anyone who wasn't looking very carefully. 62%. That was what she held. Majority in every meaningful sense. She had intended the arrangement to be temporary, a period during which she could watch what she had built without her presence distorting it. A test of culture, of whether the values she had written into the founding documents would hold their shape when she wasn't in the room. For 7 years, they mostly had. Somewhere in the last 4 or 5, something had shifted. Richard had always been profit-focused. That wasn't itself the problem. The problem was a gradual drift, a slow reorientation of what excellence meant within the company. The language had changed. The training programs had changed. The marketing had changed in ways that were subtle enough to pass without comment, but cumulative enough to reshape the environment they landed in. Premium image branding, elevated clientele experience, language that sounded like quality and acted like exclusion. She had noticed. She had begun the audit process 8 months ago. Today had simply moved the timeline. Back on the aircraft, the one now crossing the Atlantic without her. Victoria Hale was standing in the forward galley telling a story to 2 junior attendants in the tone of someone who had successfully handled a minor but meaningful challenge to their authority. She described the interaction in terms of brand protection. The passenger had been confused. The situation had been managed. The cabin remained consistent. The younger attendant, whose name was Elena, listened with her hands folded in front of her and her eyes a careful neutral. She didn't say anything. She would have something to say later through the appropriate channels, but for now she listened and kept her expression still. Somewhere over the grid of Chicago, still visible from altitude, Carter Wells was typing on his phone. He composed the tweet with the easy confidence of a man who had never needed to second-guess how his words would land. Something about standards being upheld. Something about the importance of maintaining a certain caliber of experience. He posted it without rereading it and put his phone in his jacket pocket and ordered a scotch. He would not open Twitter again for 6 hours. By the time he did, the world had rearranged itself around a video he hadn't known was being taken. The passenger who recorded it had been sitting in row 4. They hadn't filmed the whole interaction, only the last 2 minutes of it, from the point when the security officers arrived until Amara stepped off the plane. The angle was partial and the audio was inconsistent, but what came through clearly, what the algorithm found and shared and amplified in the exponential way that only certain moments triggered, was the image of a woman being escorted off an aircraft with the extraordinary stillness of someone who knows something the room doesn't. And Victoria's voice, just audible at the threshold of the jet bridge. First class is for people who breathe a different kind of air. And then a quiet reply no one could quite make out, and then the door closing. The video was posted at 9:17 a.m. By noon it had 400,000 views. By 6 in the evening it had passed 3 million. And the comment section had become a particular kind of urgent, and the phrase different kind of air had been extracted and circulated and set to music and responded to and pulled apart in the way the internet pulls things apart when it finds something that crystallizes a feeling people already had but hadn't yet named. The framing wasn't anger exactly, or it was anger, but the image at the center of it wasn't rage, it was composure. A woman being removed from a seat she had paid for and earned, and the way she had walked away. The way she had not collapsed or argued or performed distress for the camera. The comment that landed most often in the shares was some variation of, she already knew something. Richard Calloway was at a dinner in London when his communications director called to tell him. He set down his fork and listened with the expression of a man hearing a minor complication he was confident he could manage. He instructed her to have his social media team draft a general statement expressing regret over any experience that fell below Aurelius Air standards. He said to hold it until morning in case the thing burned itself out overnight. He finished his dinner. He would not sleep well that night, though he didn't know that yet. Amara, from the Horizon Club in Terminal C, did not watch the video. She had been there. She knew what it looked like. She opened her laptop instead and navigated to the secure internal portal her legal team had established during the early audit phase. She entered her credentials and pulled up the access logs for Flight 74. She read through them systematically, the check-in records, the boarding sequence, the timestamp on the secondary verification request, the communication log between the gate and the aircraft. She noted the exact language used in the crew communication, flagging her seat. She noted the captain's approval code. She noted that no one had requested the same secondary verification from any other first-class passenger that morning, a fact that the log recorded without comment and without awareness of its own significance. She compiled what she needed into a folder and encrypted it and sent it to Marcus. Then she opened a second window and drafted a brief message to her assistant. Celeste, 3 sentences, no subject heading. Schedule emergency board meeting for Friday. Majority shareholder authority. Tell them only what the protocol requires. She closed the laptop. She drank the rest of her coffee. Cold by now, but she drank it anyway. Outside the lounge's frosted glass, the airport continued its ordinary business. People moving toward things, people moving away from things, luggage rolling, children running, announcements cycling through the static edge PA system. A woman in a gray sweater sitting in a corner with a ceramic cup and a leather backpack, looking like she had all the time in the world. Which she did, because when you own the thing, the timeline is yours. Friday was 4 days away. That was 4 days of watching. 4 days of letting the video do what viral things do, and letting Richard do what defensive men do, and letting Victoria believe what insulated people believe when no one has yet handed them a mirror. 4 days for every log, every email, every training document, every budget report, every quietly coded instruction passed down through layers of management to arrange itself into a record. She wasn't angry. Anger was a response for people who didn't have a plan. She had a plan. She had always had a plan. And in 4 days, in the executive conference room on the 14th floor of Aurelius Air's Chicago headquarters, the room that she had helped fund and design and had never once sat in at the head of, she was going to sit at the head of it. Not because she was owed a spectacle, because culture didn't fix itself, because the gap between the values written at the founding of a thing and the behavior alive inside it 12 years later didn't close through press statements or diversity campaigns or carefully worded apologies issued before morning traffic. It closed when someone with the actual authority to close it decided it was time. She picked up her phone one more time and checked the departure board. The next Aurelius Air flight to London didn't leave until 6 in the evening. She would take it. She had meetings in London that mattered, and she saw no reason to let this morning cost her a trip. She booked the seat, first class, window side, and set her phone face down on the table. Then she opened her notebook, paper, small, with a worn brown cover, and began to write. Not grievances, not plans for retribution. A list of structural questions she needed answered before Friday, written in a hand that was steady and clear and took its time with every letter. The work had started. It had, in truth, started long before today. Today had simply handed it the urgency it needed. The formal notice arrived at Richard Calloway's London hotel inbox at 6:14 on Tuesday morning, while he was still on his second coffee and whatever remained of the confidence he had carried into the week. It was a single-page document, precise in its language, issued under the Emergency Shareholder Authority Clause embedded in Aurelius Air's founding charter, a clause so rarely invoked that most people inside the company had forgotten it existed at all. Emergency Board Session, Friday, 9 a.m., Chicago headquarters. Convened under Majority Shareholder Authority. Richard read it twice. Then he set down his coffee and read it a third time, because there are certain sentences that the brain processes as words before it processes them as meaning, and this was one of those sentences. In 11 years, that clause had never once been used. The majority shareholder, whoever that was, whoever sat behind the layered holding structure Richard had always found it convenient not to examine too carefully, had been entirely silent for over a decade. No interference, no directives, no presence, which had suited Richard perfectly, because silence from ownership is the best possible environment for a CEO who has gradually decided that his own instincts are the only instincts that matter. He called his deputy and asked 2 questions, both of which his deputy could not answer: who held the majority stake, and what had triggered the invocation. His deputy called legal. Legal said they needed time. Richard said he didn't have time. Legal said, respectfully, that this was a shareholder matter and would move at the pace it was going to move. Richard closed his laptop and stared at the hotel room wall. He did not yet connect the board notice to the woman on the plane. The viral video was a PR inconvenience. The board notice was a shareholder matter. In Richard's architecture of concern, these two things lived in completely separate rooms. He would understand, eventually and far too late, that they were the same room all along. Back in Chicago, the week was moving without waiting for Richard to catch up with it. At the Aurelius Air mid-management offices on the 9th floor, a cluster of supervisors had gathered around a printed copy of the internal memo that had come down from Victoria's direct manager. It praised the Flight 74 handling as a demonstration of strong brand alignment and good operational instinct. The memo was carefully worded. Nothing in it would read badly in a formal review, but its shape was unmistakably praise, and the supervisors read it that way and forwarded it and nodded over it without a single question. Victoria had seen it on her phone Tuesday morning and felt something she would later, with some difficulty, identify as relief rather than pride. Relief that the institution had confirmed she had done nothing wrong. Not pride that she had done something well. The distinction was small, but it sat in her chest in a way she couldn't quite put down, a low, persistent weight that woke her up at 3 a.m. on Tuesday and again on Wednesday and refused to explain itself. Elsewhere in the city, in the third-floor HR suite of the operations building that smelled permanently of printer toner and recycled air, a junior flight attendant was sitting across from a tired-looking HR coordinator and trying to find the right words for something that didn't have easy words. Elena Reeves was not a person who made trouble. 4 years with Aurelius Air, no formal complaints, no flags in her record. But she had been standing near the galley partition during the boarding of Flight 74. She had watched every moment of the interaction. She had seen the boarding pass, valid, gate scanned, correct in every detail. And she had said nothing, and the weight of that silence had followed her off the plane and home and into the middle of every night since Monday. I just want on record, Elena said, pressing her pen against the anonymous complaint form, that the boarding pass was valid. I saw it scanned at the gate. There was no ticketing error. Patricia, the HR coordinator, looked at her over her reading glasses. You're filing this anonymously for now. For now, Elena said. Patricia wrote something down without comment. She had worked in HR long enough to recognize the difference between someone filing a complaint for drama and someone filing a complaint so they could say, when things eventually surfaced, that they had said something before the surfacing. Elena was clearly the second kind. Patricia flagged the form for expedited review, noted its connection to Flight 74, where 2 other items had already been flagged that week, and moved quietly to her next appointment with the practical efficiency of someone who knows that the right action is sometimes simply ensuring the paper exists. By Wednesday, the internet had found Carter Wells. It happened the way these investigations always happen, incrementally, then all at once. One person zoomed into a frame of the viral video and matched a face to a Twitter profile. Another connected the profile to a LinkedIn. A name emerged and spread. Carter Wells, senior partner, Wells Capital Advisors. Then the broader excavation the internet performs on people once it decides they merit close attention. Archived conference appearances, a business magazine profile from 3 years ago in which Carter described his investment philosophy as backing companies that understood their audience, an opinion column arguing that premium brands diluted their identity by chasing mass appeal. And finally, most damaging of all, a pitch document forwarded by someone who had been in the room when it was presented and had apparently held on to it for exactly the right moment. The cover page read, "Protecting Your Premium Identity, a strategic partnership proposal for Aurelius Air executive leadership. Wells Capital Advisors." Dated 14 months ago. Addressed to Richard Calloway's office. The story shifted beneath everyone's feet. What had begun as the viral video of a woman wrongly escorted off a plane became, over the course of Wednesday, something with a longer and more deliberate spine, a culture that had been consciously shaped, financially incentivized, and shielded from challenge by people whose interests depended on it remaining exactly as it was. Carter woke Wednesday morning to 17 missed calls and a PR person whose email subject lines had escalated through 12 messages from "heads up" to "please call me right now." His original tweet about standards had accumulated replies in the thousands, almost none of them supportive. He called his lawyer before calling anyone else, which was, for the first time since Monday, the right move. Amara was back in Chicago by Wednesday evening. She sat in the conference room of a building with no Aurelius Air branding anywhere on its exterior, a printed spreadsheet on the table in front of her, and a research associate named Diane across from her, who had spent 3 full days pulling 5 years of premium cabin incident record from the operational database. The spreadsheet covered 31 incidents. Each one had been logged in procedural, institutional language, ticketing discrepancy, cabin configuration concern, customer service escalation. Language chosen to document without revealing, to record without explaining. The numbers were less careful than the language. 26 of the 31 removals involved passengers whose identity documents showed them to be black or brown. Of the remaining 5, 3 had been flagged in incident notes as presenting in casual or non-premium attire. Not one of the 31 had a verified ticketing error as its documented cause. Every single one had a valid boarding pass confirmed at the gate before the removal was initiated. Amara sat with the document for a long time without speaking. "Training materials," she said eventually. "How far back do we have them?" Diane opened her folder. 7 years. There's a clear vocabulary shift starting around 4.5 years ago. Earlier documents used language like welcoming, attentive, guest-centered. The later revisions introduce elevated experience, curated cabin environment, premium aligned service standard. Who authored the revision? The initial change originated in Richard's office. Official authorship is listed as the Brand Standards Division. A brief pause. That division was created 3.5 years ago. Under Richard's administration. Yes. Amara set the spreadsheet aside and pulled a fresh legal pad toward her. She wrote steadily, one clear line following another. The structure of what needed to be presented on Friday, assembling itself under her hand with the unhurried certainty of someone who has been building toward a thing for a long time and simply needed the final pieces to arrive. Daniel Brooks had not slept well since Monday. He was a man who had constructed his professional life around the precision of his own judgment. 20 years in commercial aviation, 11,000 flight hours, a reputation other pilots respected. He was thorough and unflappable and had always been the kind of captain who verified rather than assumed. And yet on Monday morning, he had authorized the removal of a passenger without leaving his seat, without asking a single question directly. He had taken the flight attendant's account of a situation and applied it without examination because the examination would have cost 4 minutes, and he was already behind the catering window. He had known it was wrong before the plane had cleared the runway. There had been a time, 8 years back, when Daniel had been actively vocal inside Aurelius Air about equity in crew hiring and service culture. He had believed in it genuinely, said so in internal forums, given a short interview to an aviation trade publication that he now thought about with a particular and uncomfortable clarity. And then the company had reorganized its priorities, and the initiative had dissolved quietly, and Daniel had decided that the decision had been made above his level and that his job was to fly planes, not to fight battles whose outcomes had already been determined elsewhere. He had been telling himself some version of that story every year since. On Wednesday afternoon, a formal notice arrived requesting his full account of his Flight 74 decision-making before the board review committee. He sat with the document at his kitchen table for a long time. He thought about the initiative, about the trade publication, about the catering window and the ease with which he had let it substitute for something that mattered more. Then he picked up the phone and called the board review coordinator, not to prepare defense, but to ask whether the lead investigator was available to speak before Friday. He had things he needed to say that weren't going to fit cleanly inside a formal testimony structure, and he wanted to say them while they were still honest, rather than after they had been shaped by time and self-protection into something that served him better than it served the record. Richard flew back to Chicago on Thursday morning and walked directly into his communications office. The strategy he had assembled during the flight was clean and forward-leaning. Get ahead of Friday by releasing a proactive statement, frame the board session as a governance exercise he had personally endorsed, announce a new internal review initiative, release the statement Thursday evening so Friday's headlines positioned him as decisive rather than cornered. He had the structure mapped before he landed. By mid-afternoon, his legal team told him quietly that any statement issued under Aurelius Air corporate letterhead required authorization from the majority shareholder, a charter provision that had always been there and had never, until this week, been exercised. Richard looked at his general counsel. That provision has never been exercised, he said. No, his counsel said. It hasn't needed to be. Who is blocking the authorization? The pause that followed carried more information than any direct answer would have. We expect clarity after Friday. Richard dismissed his communications team, sat down at his desk, and looked at Chicago through the floor-to-ceiling glass of his office window. He thought about 62% of an airline moving silently through layered entities for 12 years without once requiring anything from him. He thought about the 8 months of audit requests his team had fulfilled efficiently and without apparent consequence. He thought about the founding documents, which he had signed and not reopened since. He thought about the woman on the plane, her composure in the security footage, the particular steadiness with which she had walked off the aircraft. Not the walk of someone who had been defeated and accepted it, but the walk of someone who had encountered confirmation of something they already knew and had already prepared for. A cold and specific understanding arrived slowly, the way cold realizations do, not as a sudden shock, but as a temperature that keeps dropping until there is no longer any doubt about what you are sitting inside. He stood at his window for a long time and tried to find a reason the understanding was wrong. He could not find one. Friday came in clear and hard over Chicago, the sky a cold winter blue that made everything look more definite than usual. The kind of morning where there is no softness in the light and distances are easy to judge and there is nowhere to hide from the sharpness of things. By 8:30, the 14th-floor executive conference room at Aurelius Air headquarters was fully arranged. Water glasses, legal pads, name placards, the long mahogany table polished to a mirror finish. The building services team had set it up since 7. They had been told only that a full board session was scheduled and that it should be ready early and that the setup should be correct. Board members arrived through the private elevator in ones and twos between 8:30 and 8:55. All 7 came, the complete composition, which typically only assembled for the annual general meeting. They came in with the compressed, careful energy of people who have been told something significant is about to happen without being told its shape. Conversations at the water station were short. Phones were checked. Every person glanced at the door at least once before sitting down. Richard was in his seat at 8:45. His laptop was open, his presentation loaded. He had decided, through the particular stubbornness of a man who has always been good at convincing himself of things, that control of a room was still available to him if he moved quickly enough. He would open with the incident, acknowledge it as an isolated procedural failure, demonstrate that corrective steps were already underway under his guidance. He had rehearsed it twice that morning. He knew the slides. At 9 o'clock precisely, he began. His opening had the fluency of 11 years of boardrooms. Confident, well-paced, the practiced delivery of a man who had made uncertainty sound like competence for so long that the two had become, for him, indistinguishable. He named Flight 74 directly and moved through it quickly, framing it as a failure at the operational level that had already been flagged for review. He advanced to his second slide without breaking the rhythm. He was mid-sentence on the third, something about the complexity of maintaining consistent service standards across a large distributed workforce when the door opened. He didn't stop immediately. He got 2 more words out before the quality of the room's attention shifted and his own voice slowed on its own and stopped. Amara Bennett walked in. Navy-tailored suit, fitted and clean, no decoration except small gold earrings. Her hair pulled neatly back. She carried a slim leather folder under one arm, and she moved directly to the head of the table, the seat at the far end, precisely opposite Richard's, without slowing, without any hesitation that suggested she was arriving somewhere new. She sat down and set the folder on the table in front of her. Two board members rose as she crossed the room. Not social reflex recognition. Thomas Garrett and Sandra Okafor, both of whom had access to the founding ownership documentation and had known for years who the silent majority was, rose without thinking about it, the way you rise when the person who actually built the room walks into it. Richard had gone absolutely still. His presentation slide glowed on the wall behind him, a revenue chart from the premium cabin report, which now had the quality of an artifact from another era. The color had left his face in the slow, unmistakable way of someone watching a conclusion arrive that they had spent 3 days trying to outrun. "I apologize for the interruption," Amara said. The word were technically an apology and functioned as no such thing. She looked across the table at the full board with the level, unhurried regard of someone who has never needed a room's permission to occupy it. "For those who haven't been formally briefed, my name is Amara Bennett. I am the majority owner and founding investor of Aurelius Air, holding 62% of total equity through Bennett Holdings and its subsidiary entities. I have held that position since the company's inception." The silence was complete. Not the empty silence of a pause, but the dense, pressurized silence of a room in which every person is simultaneously revising their understanding of what they're sitting inside and what that means about everything that has come before. "Mr. Calloway," she said, looking directly at Richard with the same even, unrattled gaze she had held on a cold jet bridge 4 days ago. "Please don't stop on my account. You can continue." He did not continue. Thomas Garrett set down his water glass carefully. "Ms. Bennett, the board wasn't notified of your attendance today." "No," she confirmed. "You weren't." She opened the leather folder and removed a single printed document, her shareholder registration, clean and precise, each entity in the ownership chain clearly named and dated. She passed it to her left. It traveled around the table in silence. Richard watched it reach him and did not pick it up, as if touching it would close a door he was still, somewhere, hoping remained open. When the last board member had set the document down, Amara picked up the small remote beside her folder. Richard's presentation disappeared from the screen. In its place, security footage appeared. Not the shaky phone video from the passenger in row 4. This was the fixed jet bridge camera, higher resolution, the audio captured cleanly in an enclosed space with no crowd noise and no compression. It played the full 2.5 minutes. Amara walking off the aircraft with security at her sides, the length of the jet bridge. Victoria standing at the aircraft threshold with her arms folded, the final exchange. Victoria's voice came through the conference room speakers with a clarity that the social media circulation of the video had not provided. No ambiguity, no room for interpretation. Just a voice in a corridor saying exactly what it said. "First class is for people who breathe a different kind of air." And then Amara's reply, which until this moment almost no one had heard clearly. "You're right. Air changes at higher altitudes." The screen returned to gray. No one moved. Amara looked at Richard. Her voice was even and steady. "Mr. Calloway, does that statement, made by a senior Aurelius Air employee on an Aurelius Air jet bridge, to a passenger holding a valid first-class ticket, reflect the founding values of this company?" Richard looked at the table. He looked at the screen. He looked at the faces around him, none of which offered him anything at all. He had always had the language for difficult rooms. The language was gone. "No," he said. It was quiet, and it was the most honest word he had produced in a very long time. "Thank you," Amara said. She withdrew the audit summary from her folder, 12 pages, prepared by Diane, verified by Marcus, and passed it simultaneously in both directions around the table. "This is a 5-year summary of internal incident data from our premium cabin operations. 31 documented removals. 26 involving passengers of color. 0 involving verified ticketing errors. Every one of them initiated after a valid boarding pass was confirmed at the gate." She let the room read. She did not fill the silence with anything. She understood that certain information properly laid out, does its own work if given the space to do it. Sandra Okafor moved through the pages without rushing. Page 3, page 7, the data tables on page 9, and then set the document down and looked at Amara with an expression that was not surprise. It was recognition. The particular expression of someone who had known something was wrong, had said so, had been redirected, and was now holding in her hands the formal confirmation of what her instincts had been telling her for 6 years. Thomas Garrett looked up from the document. How long has this audit been active? 8 months, Amara said. Monday moved the timeline forward. Executive leadership wasn't informed? Notification to the CEO is not required under the Charter's audit provision. She let that sit in the air for exactly as long as it needed to. That provision exists for reasons this document now makes self-evident. Richard had stopped pretending to read the audit. He was looking at Amara with an expression that had moved through several phases: disbelief, the final stiffening of defensiveness, something bleaker and more honest, and had settled into something that was hard to name precisely except to say that it was the expression of a man who has been running for a long time and has just understood that the thing he was running from was always in the room he was running toward. The Brand Standards Division, Amara continued, turning to the next section, created 3.5 years ago under executive direction, responsible for the revised service training language that appears in materials from that period forward. The shift in training vocabulary corresponds precisely with the increase in discriminatory removal incidents documented in this report. She looked at the full board. This is not a story about one flight attendant making a poor call under pressure. It is a story about a culture that was built through language, through incentive structures, through training, to make that call feel like professional excellence rather than what it actually was. Richard put his hands flat on the table. Every decision I made about brand positioning was commercially justified and operationally. Understand that's your position, Amara said. The forensic audit will address the specifics. She turned back to the board. Effective immediately, I am exercising majority shareholder authority to suspend executive authority pending full independent investigation. That suspension applies to the CEO's office, the Brand Standards Division, and Passenger Services leadership. The investigation will be conducted by independent counsel with full access to communications, personnel records, and financial data. She said it without performance. She said it the way someone states a decision that has been carefully made and is no longer open for discussion. Firmly, without cruelty, without any inflection that invited negotiation. Sandra Okafor looked at the board members on either side of her and then looked back to Amara. I'll second the motion. The vote was conducted formally, names recorded in order. 5 in favor of suspending executive authority and initiating independent investigation. 2 against. Richard, when his turn came, said nothing. The company secretary recorded it as an abstention, and everyone in the room understood what the silence meant. 5-2. Carried. Richard sat in his chair without moving while the meeting reorganized itself around the next items. Council availability, timeline, scope of the independent review. The conversation moved past him the way a current moves past something that has stopped being part of the flow, and he sat very still inside it. Amara wrote down the vote count and the timestamp. She turned to the final page of her notes. She looked at the full board, the 5 who had voted with her, the 2 who hadn't, and Richard sitting with his hands on the table, with the direct, unsparing regard of someone who believes that clarity is its own form of respect. I want to be clear about what we are doing and what we are not doing, she said. We are not making an example of individuals so that the institution can feel clean. We are not issuing statements and forming task forces as substitutes for structural change. What we are building, and what I came back to build, is a company whose internal culture matches the values written into its founding. If we address the people and leave the system intact, we will be sitting in this room again in 3 years with a different incident and the same underlying record. She closed her folder. We are not doing that. The room held a silence that had room in it, not the compressed, resistant silence of earlier, but something that had enough space to actually breathe inside. The air didn't change at altitude, Amara said. Her voice was quiet and level and carried the full weight of everything that had brought her to this seat she had funded and never until today sat in. The culture did. She looked at no single person. She looked at the room, the whole thing, the table and the window and the people and all of it. And then she turned to the next page of her notes, and the real work, the work that would take months and would not be finished with a single vote or a single sentence, began. The news broke before lunch on Friday. No one inside the boardroom had leaked it. The meeting had ended at 11:40, and the formal press release was not scheduled until Monday. But these things travel through buildings the way cold air travels through old walls, through gaps no one thought to seal, along paths no architect designed. By 12:30, a financial reporter at the Tribune had a source. By 1 o'clock, 3 words were moving through aviation industry channels like a lit fuse running towards something large. Majority shareholder active. By 2 in the afternoon, Aurelius Air stock had dropped 4.5%. By 3, it had recovered 2 of those points as analysts released notes suggesting that decisive governance action by a previously silent owner might signal structural improvement rather than instability. By 4, it had dropped again as other analysts disagreed, and the market spent the remainder of the trading day arguing with itself about what a 12-year silent majority shareholder suddenly becoming visible meant for the future of an airline. Financial reporters updated their pages. Cable business news featured analysts who had never heard of Amara Bennett confidently explaining who she probably was. Richard Calloway watched the ticker from his car in the parking structure beneath headquarters, where he had been sitting since security had quietly asked him to vacate his office pending the formal suspension processing. His phone was in his hand and had been in his hand for 90 minutes. He had called 4 people. 2 had not answered. 1 had answered and spoken carefully in the measured way of a person who has already decided which side of a situation they're going to be on and is simply being polite about the transition. The 4th, a board member he had considered a reliable ally, had told him plainly that the math did not support a no-confidence challenge against 62%, and that Richard should be speaking to personal counsel rather than company counsel from this point forward. He sat in his car for a long time after that call ended, the phone dark in his hand, watching the parking structure's fluorescent lights buzz against the concrete ceiling. He had spent 11 years in the building above him, making decisions that shaped the careers and livelihoods of thousands of people. And now he was sitting in its basement in the particular limbo of a man whose authority has been suspended, but whose body hasn't yet been told where to go instead. The building that had been his professional home for over a decade was 60 feet above his head, and it felt from the parking structure as unreachable as a different country. He scrolled, without quite intending to the Aurelius Air trending results on his phone. The headline that appeared most frequently was not about the board vote or the stock price or the suspension of executive authority. It was about Amara, her name, her photograph, a conference photo from 7 years ago that someone had unearthed, and the emerging story of who she was and how she had built the company from the inside without ever being visible in it. Some of the coverage was openly admiring, in the way that surprise at a black woman's power produces admiration in certain media circles, as if the existence of the power is itself the remarkable thing. Richard turned off his phone screen and sat in the dark of the parking structure. He did not call anyone else. He drove home. Victoria Hale clocked in at 2:15 for the afternoon shift rotation, rolling her bag through the employee entrance, badge swiped, locker found, uniform jacket straightened in the break room mirror. The ordinary rituals of a job performed so many times they had become automatic, the body going through familiar motions while the mind stayed somewhere else entirely. She had read the news about the board meeting that morning and registered it with the particular unease of someone watching a distant storm system that still felt theoretical on a map. The viral video was one problem. Corporate governance was a different layer. She had not yet understood how completely they were the same layer. She was 20 feet from gate D9, pulling her bag through the concourse crowd, when the supervisor came toward her with the careful, neutral expression of someone carrying a message they did not write and would prefer not to be delivering. He asked her to come with him. He said it was routine. His voice and his face were doing slightly different things, the way they do when nothing about a situation is routine at all. The HR suite on the third floor had two people she had never met. One who introduced himself as outside counsel retained by the majority shareholder's office, and one who introduced herself as lead investigator on the internal review. Patricia, the usual coordinator, was not present. The investigator told Victoria, clearly and without embellishment, that her conduct on Flight 74 was under formal review, being conducted directly under majority shareholder authority. That the process would include a series of accountability interviews before any final determination was made. That Victoria had the full right to legal representation throughout. "Do I need a lawyer?" Victoria asked. The question came out sounding less like a legal inquiry and more like the first honest admission that the ground she had been standing on had shifted beneath her without warning. "That is entirely your right," the investigator said. "We would strongly encourage you to arrange that." After they left the room, Victoria sat alone at the conference table. She took out her phone. She opened the video of Flight 74. Not the viral version, but a slightly longer cut that someone had shared in a private staff group, which she had been deliberately not opening for 4 days, and pressed play. She watched herself standing at the aircraft threshold with her arms folded and her chin lifted in the manner of someone who has just successfully handled something. She heard her own voice say the words. They had felt inside the insulated context of that jet bridge, like professional judgment, like exactly the kind of decisive action the past 4 years of briefings, training cycles, and praise performance reviews have been building her toward. Here, in this empty conference room, with no ambient noise and no sense of institutional backing, and nowhere to put the words except directly in front of her, they sounded like something that had been dressed in the language of excellence until it no longer needed to announce what it was actually measuring. She listened to the end. She set the phone face down on the table. She sat with that for a long time before she called her lawyer. Carter Wells released a statement Friday afternoon through his communications director. It used the words regret and context and mischaracterized 3 times across 5 carefully constructed paragraphs. It did not address the leaked pitch document directly. Carter's legal team had advised against acknowledging it until they had fully assessed the exposure, and the resulting statement had the quality of something designed to cover a great deal of ground without touching the one specific piece of ground that everyone was standing on. The internet noticed the gap immediately and spent Friday evening and all of Saturday filling it with the kind of systematic, documented attention Carter had only previously experienced being directed at other people from a comfortable distance. By Friday evening, 2 of Wells Capital's anchor clients had sent quiet letters requesting meetings to discuss the firm's current positioning. One came from a pension fund whose board members have been extensively tagged in social media threads directly connecting Carter to the Aurelius air pitch document. The other came from a family office whose principal had attended 2 industry conferences with Carter in the past 18 months and was now highly motivated to establish visible distance between their names in any future coverage. The letters were professionally worded and entirely noncommittal. They were also numbers rather than noise, and Carter understood the difference in a way that the public backlash, which had been both loud and extensive, had not quite managed to produce in him. He had been in finance long enough to know that reputation damage that stayed in the media was manageable and often temporary. Reputation damage that moved into a client letter requesting a meeting to discuss the relationship was a categorically different order of problem, because that letter was a financial signal rather than a social one, and financial signals did not burn out on their own. He called his lawyer back that evening, and they talked for a very long time about things Carter had not, until this week, imagined would require legal discussion. The conversation covered defamation thresholds, corporate liability exposure from the pitch document, and the distinction between public criticism and actionable statements. Carter listened carefully and said very little. At the end of the call, he asked whether the pitch document leak was itself actionable. His lawyer told him that pursuing that line would draw more attention to the document's contents, not less. Carter was quiet for a long time, which was the most sensible response available to him. On Saturday morning, Amara was back in the building without announcement. She did not go to the 14th floor. She took the elevator to the 5th, which held the operations coordination team, and walked through it without calling ahead, without an assistant introducing her, without the particular contained energy of an executive on inspection. She moved the way she always moved through spaces she was genuinely trying to understand, observing without announcing the observation, noting things without displaying that she was cataloging them. She had coffee in the fifth-floor break room with 4 members of the operations staff who did not initially recognize her. When they did, there was a brief, visible stiffening, the instinct of people who realize they are in the presence of someone with significant authority over their employment and begin quickly reviewing everything they have said and whether it constitutes a problem. She let the silence sit for a moment and then said, with complete simplicity, "I'm not here to evaluate anyone. I came to listen. Tell me what it's actually like to work here." It took a few minutes for them to decide she meant it. Then it took very little time at all for them to tell her a great many things they had never been asked. She learned that the shift in the premium briefings had been gradual enough that no single change had felt significant in isolation, just a slow, accumulating adjustment in language that carried a specific understood meaning beneath its professional surface. That phrases like elevated clientele, curated cabin environment, and consistent passenger profile had entered the training cycle over the past 4 years and communicated an implicit standard that no one was ever required to state aloud, but that everyone absorbed and applied. That the definition of something going wrong in the first-class cabin had quietly expanded to include passengers whose appearance disrupted the visual consistency of the space, independent of any conduct or policy issue. She also heard what was working. A gate agent process that had reduced missed connections by 18% without additional staffing. A logistics manager who had redesigned the catering coordination system from scratch on his own time and rolled it out over a single weekend without requesting approval because he didn't think it needed a committee to be obvious. A ground crew lead whose passenger assistance protocol 3 other carriers had adapted without crediting him. Good work happening at every level, invisible to the floors above it, unrewarded by the structures designed to evaluate it because the structures had been tuned to different frequencies. She wrote all of it in her brown notebook without distinction between the troubling and the encouraging because both were equally part of what she needed to understand. She stayed 3 hours on the 5th floor and 3 more on the 3rd floor that afternoon, and she did not take a single meeting with anyone above middle management for the entire weekend. The forensic communications audit, ordered Friday, begun by the independent counsel's team over the weekend, returned preliminary results Monday morning. The lead auditor noted first, in his report to Amara's counsel, that there were no explicit discriminatory directives anywhere in the written record. No emails in which anyone had written an instruction to remove passengers based on race or appearance. People sophisticated enough to build this kind of institutional culture were, as a rule, sophisticated enough to understand that the explicit instruction was the one piece of documentation that could not be allowed to exist in writing, because the explicit instruction was the thing that turned defensible individual decisions into an indefensible pattern. What existed instead was the long, sustained record of the adjacent thing. Emails from Richard's office referencing the importance of protecting the premium experience and ensuring the forward cabin reflected the brand's elevated positioning. Replies from brand standards to service training about refining the delivery profile of first-class service and maintaining aesthetic consistency throughout the customer journey. Performance reviews awarding elevated ratings for exceptional cabin environment management, with no elaboration on what that management had actually involved in practice. Praise memos confirming that the behavior being praised reflected exactly the standard the institution was seeking to maintain. One email chain stood out. It was 14 months old, sent 2 days after the Wells Capital pitch meeting, from Richard's deputy to the head of the brand standards division, with a subject line follow-up from Wednesday. The body referenced thinking carefully about the passenger profile in the forward cabin as part of the broader brand elevation strategy. The reply from brand standards, understood, will incorporate into Q4 training cycle. The Q4 training materials were in the file. The language shift was in the materials. The incident log numbers were in Diane's spreadsheet. The compensation structure tied to premium brand metrics was in Richard's executive bonus documentation. No single document said the thing directly. Together, they said nothing else. The auditor forwarded his preliminary findings to Amara's counsel and noted that the federal regulators who had formally contacted Aurelius Air on Friday would almost certainly reach the same conclusions through their own parallel process, and that the timeline should be planned accordingly. Daniel Brooks testified before the board review committee on Monday without legal counsel present. His own lawyer had advised strongly against this. Daniel had listened and made his own decision. He described his decision-making on Flight 74 with precision and without self-protection. He described the moment at the cockpit door, the questions about the catering window, the fact that he had not reviewed the boarding pass himself or asked a single direct question or moved from his seat to verify what was actually happening. He described 11 years of understanding, at some level, that the culture around him was drifting in a direction he did not believe in, and the accumulation of small, individually defensible choices that had added up, year by year, to sustain silence about things he knew. He described the working group from 8 years back. He described the interview he had given to the trade publication. He described the retreat, not as one decision, but as a series of them, each chosen for a reason that felt adequate in the moment and that he now understood had never been adequate at all. He said he was not asking for any particular outcome. He said he would accept the determination of the review process and fulfill whatever remediation it required. He said the reason he had come without counsel was not a belief that this would improve his situation. He was clear-eyed that it might not, but because he had spent too many years in rooms where speaking honestly might have mattered, choosing silence instead, and he was not willing to do it again in a room where it would matter most of all. There was a long pause after he finished. The investigator looked at her notes and then looked at him directly, with the particular attention of someone who has heard a great many prepared accounts and is encountering something that is not one. She asked whether he would be willing to be involved in training programs for other crew members as part of any remediation process, should that direction be recommended. He said yes without hesitating. She asked whether that willingness came from a desire to improve his professional standing or from something else. He thought about it for a genuine moment, which she noted, and said that he thought it came from the same place as the decision to come without a lawyer, that he was tired of performing accountability while privately bargaining for a lighter consequence, that he wanted to actually do the thing rather than demonstrate doing it. The investigator wrote something down. She thanked him, noted the session on record, and did not indicate what the recommendation would be. The accountability interviews began on Tuesday. Victoria arrived with her lawyer, who had reviewed the structure and confirmed that full cooperation was in her best interest. Victoria had arrived at the same conclusion through a different route, not as calculated strategy, but because she had watched the video of herself on that jet bridge for more times over the weekend and had reached the point where building a defense felt like a project she simply did not have materials for anymore. The lead investigator, Carolyn Grant, did not open the first session with the jet bridge incident. She began with training, with the briefings Victoria had attended over the past 4 years, with the language she had absorbed and repeated and passed down to junior staff. She asked Victoria to describe, in her own words, what protecting the brand had come to mean in practical daily terms inside the first-class cabin. Victoria answered slowly, and as she answered, she heard herself describing something that had seemed, from inside it, like a coherent professional standard, specific, teachable, something you could be trained toward and evaluated against with clear criteria. And that sounded, when she was articulating it for an investigator with a recorder running on the table between them, like a set of aesthetic judgments that had been wearing the clothing of procedural language for so long they had forgotten what they were underneath it. At the time of the incident, Carolyn said, "Did you believe the passenger had an invalid ticket?" The pause lasted several seconds. "No," Victoria said. "I believe she didn't look like someone who should be in that seat." She said it quietly, and the saying of it landed in the room with the weight of a thing that has been true for a while being acknowledged aloud for the first time by the person who made it true. That belief, Carolyn said, with no particular inflection, came from where? Victoria looked at the table. From the environment I had been working in for 4 years. Carolyn wrote something down and moved to the next question. Victoria's lawyer, who had been prepared to redirect several earlier answers, sat back and said nothing because there was nothing to redirect from a statement that honest. After the session ended and Victoria had left the building with her lawyer, Carolyn sat alone in the conference room for a few minutes reviewing her notes. She had conducted dozens of these interviews over the course of her career. What she had just documented was not typical, not the careful, calibrated partial admission designed to limit liability, not the insistence on framing the distributed responsibility broadly enough to make individual accountability feel unfair. What she had documented was someone describing, with reasonable precision, how a culture had taught her to see a thing as professional judgment that was not professional judgment, and doing so without the defensive scaffolding most people erected automatically in her presence. She wrote her observations into the record and prepared for the next session. Elena Reeves was called to a different meeting on Tuesday afternoon. Not the formal interview process, but a private conversation in a sixth-floor conference room that she was told had been requested directly by the owner. She arrived 5 minutes early, sat with her hands folded, and kept her breathing even. She had filed the anonymous complaint because it was the right thing to do, and she had understood when filing it that right thing sometimes carried professional consequences that good intentions didn't protect against. Amara came in alone, without an assistant and without the leather folder. She sat across from Elena and said, without preamble, "I've read your complaint. I wanted to speak with you personally." Elena nodded. "First," Amara said, "I want you to know that what you documented, and that you documented it when you did, matters. You created a formal record before anyone asked you to, and that record is part of why the evidentiary timeline looks the way it does." She paused. "I also have some questions, if you're willing. Not for the investigation, for my own understanding of what we need to build going forward." She asked what the gradual cultural shift had felt like from Elena's position, junior, without institutional authority, to push back against what came down from above. She asked what Elena had understood, practically, the consequences of speaking up through official channels would have been. She asked what would have needed to exist, structurally, concretely, for someone in Elena's position to have spoken sooner and actually been heard. Elena answered honestly, including the difficult part, that there had been no visible functioning channel. No system connecting a junior staff member's concern to anyone with both the authority and the genuine motivation to act on it. No evidence, from where she stood, that raising a concern through official means would reach anyone who had not already been shaped by the same environment producing the concern. Amara listened without interrupting. She wrote in her notebook, "You'll continue in your current role," she said when Elena was finished. "And the gap you described, the missing channel, I want you involved in building one. Not as a symbolic gesture, with real authority in the design and genuine accountability for how it functions in practice." Elena looked at her carefully. "You mean that?" she said. It sat between a question and a statement, as if she was deciding whether to let herself believe it before committing to the response. "I mean it," Amara said. "No qualificación, no elaboración." Something in Elena's chest that had been compressed since Monday of the previous week eased slightly. Not all the way, not yet, but enough to feel like the beginning of something that might become different from what had come before. She had not expected to leave the meeting feeling anything other than relieved that it was over. She left feeling something closer to purposeful, which was a feeling she had not associated with this job in a very long time. The forensic audit findings on Richard's personal compensation structure arrived late Tuesday afternoon. 3 years of performance bonuses tied specifically to brand elevation metrics. A structure Richard had approved for his own role in coordination with a subset of the board who had not raised objections because the language the structure used was financial and the incentive it created was invisible unless you were looking for it from a particular angle. Structured so that improvements in premium class revenue and premium brand visibility scores compounded into his annual bonus by significant percentages across 3 consecutive years. Legally documented, financially clean on its surface, directly intertwined with the same training language and cultural drift that had been filtering down through 4 years of operational practice into daily staff behavior. Richard had not authored a single training document. He had not issued a single direct instruction to any flight attendant regarding any passenger. But he had built a compensation architecture that made it profitable to define excellence in a particular direction, then overseeing the institution of a training system that translated that definition into daily behavior across thousands of staff members, then approved the praise documentation that confirmed to those staff members that the behavior was exactly correct. Amara read the findings and sat quietly with them. She did not spend the time on anger. Anger had its proper uses and its proper moments, and this was not one of them. She spent the time on the honest accounting of what the distance between her founding intention and this document represented. Not in terms of blame, but in terms of what building something and then remaining absent from it over a long period had actually allowed to happen. She had believed the values were durable enough to hold without her. She had been wrong about that in a specific and instructive way. She wrote it in her notebook and did not look away from it. Richard Callaway's formal removal as CEO came through by board vote on Wednesday afternoon. 5-2, the same geometry as Friday, as if the week had been one long, continuous vote on the same question answered the same way twice. 2 hours later, a member of building security walked with him from the executive floor to the lobby. His assistant had packed a cardboard box. He carried it through the lobby past the curved reception desk, where the Aurelius Air logo was mounted in brushed silver against the feature wall, past the glass entrance doors that slid open automatically and would have slid open for anyone, and out onto the sidewalk where the Chicago wind came at him directly without any accommodation. He stood on the pavement with the box. He had always imagined, at some unexamined level, that losing something this large would feel proportionate to its size, dramatic, vast, an event that announced itself with the weight it deserved. It felt instead like standing on a public sidewalk with a box under one arm while the city moved around him with its characteristic and total indifference to whatever had just concluded in the building behind him. The scale of what had happened and the ordinariness of how it felt were completely mismatched, and he stood in that mismatch for a moment, holding his box before the wind made stillness untenable. A woman walking past looked briefly at the box, then at his face, then kept moving in the efficient way of people who have somewhere to be. He walked to his car. Upstairs on the 14th floor, Amara was not watching him leave. She was 3 sections into the next set of notes: the structural architecture of the leadership transition, the sequencing of the independent review timeline, the interim governance framework that needed to be functional before the week ended. A call with independent counsel in 18 minutes. A 4 o'clock with Sandra Okafor about board responsibilities during the transition. The weekend's worth of employee town hall feedback, 12 pages of it, still waiting to be read through fully. The work did not pause for endings, because endings were not what this was about. What came after the endings was what this was about, and what came after them required showing up to the next page and then the next one, without performance or ceremony or the distraction of dwelling in the dramatic shape of things that had already concluded. She turned the page. Outside, 14 floors below, Chicago went on with its particular indifferent continuity. The traffic and the wind and the cold winter light moving through the streets exactly as they had before any of this began, and exactly as they would long after. The press conference was scheduled for Thursday morning at 10 in the main atrium of Aurelius Air Chicago headquarters. It had been announced 48 hours in advance. Enough time for media to arrange coverage, not enough for speculation to fully calcify into narrative. Amara had chosen the atrium deliberately, not the executive boardroom, not a hotel ballroom with a branded backdrop. The atrium, where employees moved every day on the way to their shifts, where the building's working life was visible through the glass walls overhead. By 9:50, every seat was filled. Camera crews lined the back wall, 3 rows deep. Reporters stood along both sides. Upstairs on the walkway balconies, employees had gathered at the railing. Ground staff, gate agents, operations coordinators, flight attendants, watching from above in the particular silence of people who have heard many things said about the place they work and are waiting to hear something true. Amara walked in at 10 o'clock exactly. She wore the same gray sweater and jeans she had been wearing on the morning of Flight 74. It was not a coincidence, and the people who had seen the video recognized it immediately. A small, deliberate signal, not theatrical, just honest. She carried no notes. She stood at the podium, looked out at the room, and began without preamble. "My name is Amara Bennett," she said. "I'm the founder and majority owner of Aurelius Air. 2 weeks ago, I was removed from one of my own flights for looking like I didn't belong in first class." The room was completely still. "I'm not telling this story to punish individuals," she continued. "I am telling it because culture does not correct itself by being exposed once and then ignored. The incident on Flight 74 was not an aberration. Our own internal audit documented 31 comparable removal incidents over 5 years. 26 involved passengers of color. Not one involved a verified ticketing error." She paused, letting the numbers settle in the room. "What happened to me was the most visible instance of a pattern that had been occurring without visibility for years." She looked at the cameras. "That is what I am here to change." She outlined the reforms without consulting notes. A full forensic audit of executive communications, already underway, with findings to be publicly summarized. Independent discrimination review of all 31 documented removal incidents, with direct outreach to affected passengers. Mandatory ethics recalibration across the entire executive and management tier. A transparent ticketing review system, externally audited, with quarterly public reports. Leadership rotation programs requiring senior staff to cycle through operational roles at every level. And a new internal reporting channel, designed with Elena Reeves, she said, naming her directly, that would connect frontline staff concerns to independent oversight rather than to the management layer they might be reporting about. She answered questions for 35 minutes. She was direct and specific and did not issue a single non-answer, which was so unusual in a corporate press setting that several reporters initially rephrased their questions, expecting a deflection that did not come. One reporter near the front asked whether this was a calculated response to bad press, designed to protect the company's stock value. Amara looked at her steadily. "The audit was begun 8 months ago," she said. "Before the video, before the stock fluctuation, before anyone outside my legal team knew my name in connection with this company. The incident on Flight 74 accelerated a timeline, but it did not create one." A brief pause. "I would ask you to report that accurately." The reporter wrote it down. The employees on the upper balconies had gone very still during the speech and did not move immediately when it ended. Then, slowly, someone began to clap. A gate agent near the east railing, who seemed almost surprised to find himself doing it, and it spread along the balconies in the unhurried way that genuine responses travel, not the coordinated surge of an arranged ovation, but something person by person, each one deciding independently. Down on the floor, several journalists were already typing. A few were not. 2 of them, Amara noticed, had simply set their phones down on their laps and were sitting with the particular quiet of people who had come expecting a corporate event and found themselves somewhere that required a slightly different kind of attention. She took note of that in the way she took note of most things, without comment, without performance, filing it into the part of her mind that cataloged the texture of situations for later use. Daniel Brooks sat in the 3rd row during the press conference. He had not been required to attend. He came on his own, arriving early and taking a seat without identifying himself, sitting through the whole thing with the particular attention of a man who has been given reason to believe that something he had given up on was still possible. When it was over, he did not approach Amara. He went back to the administrative role he was serving in during the review period and spent the afternoon reviewing the new ethics training module drafted by independent counsel's team. It was detailed and specific and honest about the kinds of situations it was addressing, which was different from the compliance training he had sat through in previous years. Training that always had the quality of something designed to create a legal record rather than change actual behavior. He read through the module twice and wrote notes in the margins about passages that could be sharper or more direct. He found one section, in particular, that addressed the moment when a crew member receives a directive from a superior that their own judgment suggests is wrong. The existing language recommended consulting the policy manual and flagging concerns through the appropriate channel. Daniel crossed it out and wrote in the margin, "This is where the decision actually happens. The policy manual is not in the room with you. You are." He rewrote the section around that premise. He sent the full set of notes to the training team with a single line. "These are suggestions. Use them if they're useful." The training team used all of them. Victoria's personal statement was released on Friday afternoon through her own social media account rather than a publicist or corporate communications team. It was 3 paragraphs long. It did not use the word sorry more than once, a deliberate choice she had made after writing a much longer version full of apologies that, reading it back, felt more like a performance of remorse than an actual accounting of what she understood. What it said instead was that she had been part of a culture she had helped reinforce without examining it, that she had accepted institutional validation as a substitute for personal moral judgment, that she had said something on that jet bridge which no professional standard could justify, and that she now understood, having had weeks to sit with it without the insulation of institutional approval, that the environment she had normalized was one she had helped construct through her daily choices, not something imposed on her from outside. The response divided public opinion as Amara had expected. Some found the statement insufficient. Others found in it something that looked like the beginning of genuine reckoning and said so. A smaller group engaged seriously with the language about institutional culture and individual complicity, which moved the conversation past the specific incident and toward the structural question, which was, in Amara's estimation, the most useful place for it to travel. Victoria did not respond to any of the replies. She had said what she needed to say. What happened to it afterward belonged to the people reading it. Carter Wells filed a defamation claim the following Monday, naming 3 social media accounts and 2 online journalists whose coverage of the pitch document he argued had misrepresented his firm's intentions and caused measurable financial damage. The filing was his lawyer's recommendation, framed as a defensive move that might suppress further coverage through the implied cost of litigation. Carter had agreed to it. Within 24 hours of the filing becoming public, the full text of the pitch document, which Carter's legal action had now entered into the public record as an exhibit, was reproduced by 4 major news outlets that had previously only summarized it. The document's specific language about protecting premium identity and managing the passenger profile of the forward cabin was now available to anyone with an internet connection, permanently and irrefutably attached to a federal court exhibit. Carter's lawyer called him that evening. They spoke briefly. Carter did not file anything further. Aurelius Ayers stock closed on Friday of that week at its highest point in 14 months. Analyst notes cited decisive governance, reform, and transparent executive accountability. One note from an analyst who had covered the airline since its 2nd year of operation said, "The company appears to have remembered what it was built for." Amara read the note at her desk, the same desk she had funded and never previously sat behind, folded it once, and put it in the drawer without comment. Then she picked up her notebook and her backpack and took the elevator down to the atrium and walked out into the evening and crossed the street and ordered coffee from a cart and drank it standing up, watching the building from the outside, the way she had watched it for 12 years from a distance that had never been as large as it looked. On Friday evening, she boarded an Aurelius Air flight to New York. She had told no one at the airline she would be on it. She booked her seat through the standard portal under her own name, arrived at the gate alone with her leather backpack and gray sweater, and boarded when her group was called. She settled into her seat and watched how the cabin staff moved through the boarding process, how they greeted passengers, whether the quality of attention was uniform across the cabin or whether it shifted in the small, revealing ways she had learned to read over years of paying attention to things most people didn't notice they were doing. What she saw was not perfect. No culture corrected itself in 2 weeks. But what she saw was different from the morning of Flight 74. And the difference was not superficial. It was in the consistency of the greetings, in the eye contact that didn't waver when it landed on a passenger who looked different from the person before, in the small, unhurried moment given to a passenger moving slowly, offered without being requested. Small things. She noted them the way she always noted things, quietly, without announcing the observation. A passenger settled into the seat beside her, arranged her bag, sat back, and glanced over with the easy warmth of someone who simply means what they say. "That's a great sweater," the woman said. "Thank you," Amara said. No second glance. No to assessment. The woman opened her book, and the plane began to push back, and the lights of Chicago spread below as they climbed, the city's grid resolving at altitude into something that looked, from above, like a system, ordered, connected, each part holding its place in relation to all the others. The new mission statement was unveiled at the all-staff assembly in February, nearly 4 months after the morning of Flight 74. It had taken that long because Amara had refused to rush it. She had rejected 2 earlier drafts. The first because it sounded like marketing copy. The second because it had been written almost entirely by the communications team and carried the smooth, managed quality of language designed to perform a value rather than describe one. She sent both back with the same note. This should sound like the people who actually work here because they should have written it. The third draft came from 6 weeks of working sessions across 12 employee groups, facilitated by an external consultant given one directive: let people say what they actually think. The sessions produced arguments and revisions and disagreements, and, eventually, a document that no single person could claim authorship of and that nearly everyone, reading it, recognized as containing something they had contributed. The statement was 43 words. Aurelius Air exists to move people with dignity. Every seat, every gate, every altitude. We build this standard daily, not in how we describe ourselves, but in what we do when no one is asking us to prove it. Amara stood at the front of the assembly hall and read it aloud without additions. Then she sat down. The applause built slowly, the way it does when people are responding to something that genuinely means something, and it held for a long time. The Shadow Travel Program launched in March. Every senior executive and department head was required to fly Aurelius Air routes twice per quarter in different seating classes, traveling under their own names without any staff notification. Records were maintained by Elena's oversight office and reviewed quarterly. If an executive submitted a report describing service as excellent across the board, Elena's team cross-referenced it against the anonymous staff feedback from the same flight period. Discrepancies were flagged and discussed directly. In the first quarter, several executives discovered that the experience of the airline was substantially different depending on where you were sitting in it. 2 wrote candid internal memos about what they had observed. 1 submitted a glowing report and was called into a meeting with Elena's team where the cross-reference data was laid on the table in front of him. He rewrote the report. Daniel Brooks returned to active flight status in March, after completing his leadership retraining program and a formal board review that considered his voluntary testimony, his cooperation throughout the investigation, and the training department's assessment of his work on the ethics curriculum. His reinstatement carried conditions: quarterly ethics reviews for 2 years, a mentorship commitment to junior pilots, and a standing obligation to speak honestly in any internal forum where the company's culture was being assessed. He had agreed to all of them before they were formally required. On his first flight back, he walked through the cabin before departure the way captains do, checking the crew, confirming the configuration, doing the visible work of readiness. He stopped briefly at each row and made brief, genuine eye contact with each passenger, not to assess them or evaluate them, just to see them the way you see someone when you've decided they're worth seeing. It was a small thing. He knew it was a small thing. He did it anyway, and he kept doing it on every flight after that. Elena Reeves's oversight office became operational in April, a 4-person team with an independent reporting line directly to the board's ethics subcommittee, not to executive management, not to HR, not to any layer of the organization subject to pressure from above. Staff could submit concerns through an encrypted portal, by phone through a third-party intake coordinator, or in person at any of 12 intake offices established across Aurelius Air's major hubs. In the first 3 months, the office received 47 submissions. 31 were service quality observations. 9 were workplace concerns. 5 were potential policy violations escalated to appropriate review. 2 were something Elena had not anticipated. Not complaints at all, but suggestions from frontline staff about operational improvements that had previously had no channel to travel through, and that turned out, when reviewed, to be genuinely useful ideas that were implemented. Elena read every submission personally in the first quarter and wrote a brief individual response to each one. Her intake coordinator noted that this approach would not scale efficiently as volume grew. Elena said she understood the scaling concern and was doing it anyway, because the whole point of the channel was that someone was actually listening, and she intended to demonstrate that with her own attention rather than just assigning it to a process. She also made a point in those first months of walking the terminals during her own flights. Not inspecting, just being present in the way that someone carrying genuine responsibility for a system needs to be present in it. She bought coffee at gate stands. She asked ground crew questions about their shifts. She talked to gate agents the way someone talks to gate agents when they are trying to understand the job rather than evaluate the person doing it. Most of them had never, in their careers, been asked those questions by someone who could actually change anything as a result of the answers. Aurelius Air also announced a scholarship initiative in partnership with 3 aviation training academies, funding full tuition for underrepresented students pursuing commercial pilot certification, aircraft maintenance, and air traffic control credentials. The initiative was not given a branded name. It was described in an internal memo announcing it simply as returning to something we should have been doing from the beginning. Victoria Hale did not return to aviation. She had completed the full accountability interview process and the restorative sessions Amara had required before any final determination. The sessions have been difficult in the way that honest examinations of one's own complicity tend to be. Not because the questions were unfair, but because the honest answers kept arriving in forms she hadn't prepared for and couldn't deflect into something more comfortable. She found work in hospitality management at a hotel group in Atlanta. In the interview, she had told her new employer a version of what had happened. Honest, without self-serving embellishment, not dwelling on it, but not hiding it either. Her new employer had hired her because the honesty, offered without drama or excuse-making, suggested someone who understood her own history clearly enough to be less likely to repeat it. She was not a transformed person in the way that stories sometimes require. She was a person doing the daily work of being somewhat better than she had been, paying closer attention to the environment she was part of and what she was contributing to them, which was, Amara would have said if asked, exactly the right place for someone like Victoria to land. Not destroyed, not absolved, but accountable and continuing. Richard Calloway resurfaced 8 months after his removal, announced as a strategic consultant for a boutique airline startup in the Pacific Northwest, positioning itself as a premium luxury carrier targeting high-net-worth travelers. The announcement described his extensive experience building premium aviation brands without mentioning Aurelius Air by name. The startup ran a pilot program for 6 months. Reviews were mixed. The brand positioning attracted a narrow market but struggled to justify its costs. An anonymous employee survey in the first quarter, which found its way to a travel industry newsletter, described a cultural environment with a specific and familiar architecture. The startup pivoted its positioning 8 months in and replaced its original leadership team. Richard was not part of the new structure. Amara returned to O'Hare on a Tuesday morning in May, 6 months after the original morning of Flight 74. She went to Terminal D, Gate D19. She arrived an hour before her scheduled departure and sat in the same row of seats where she had sat on that earlier morning, with the same leather backpack and the same gray sweater and a black coffee from the same stand near the gate. She did not announce herself to the gate staff. She sat and watched. She watched the staff at the desk and how they moved through passenger questions with patience or without it. She watched the boarding process and the rhythm of how the gate filled and how people were received when they arrived. She watched a gate agent across the concourse spend several unhurried minutes helping an elderly passenger navigate a boarding issue. Not because a supervisor was watching, not because any performance was required, but simply because the passenger needed help and the agent was choosing to give it fully rather than partially. Amara had come here partly to confirm something and partly just to sit in the place where it had happened and see what it felt like now. It felt different, not finished. She was too careful a thinker to call anything finished that was still in process, but different in ways that were real and measurable if you knew how to look for them. The quality of attention at the desk. The way the agent had not visibly calculated whether the elderly passenger merited the additional time. Small calibrations that individually meant very little and that together meant everything, because culture had always worked that way. Not in declarations, but in the 10,000 daily choices that either held a standard or quietly let it go. A child ran past and grabbed a seat 2 spots down, and her mother apologized from a few feet away. Amara said it was absolutely fine, which it was. When her flight was called, she stood, slung her backpack over one shoulder, and walked to the gate. She handed over her boarding pass. The reader beeped green. The gate agent said, "Have a wonderful flight," and meant it in the easy, ordinary way of someone doing their work well. She said thank you and walked down the jet bridge, the same narrow corridor she had been walked off 6 months earlier, going in the opposite direction now. She found her seat, first class, window side, and settled in and looked out the window at the tarmac. The morning was clear and still, the ground crew moving below with the quiet efficiency of people who knew their work without needing to be watched for it. The plane pushed back. It taxied and gathered speed and lifted, the ground releasing its hold in that particular moment when the weight of everything eases and the city below becomes briefly abstract. The buildings small, the roads thin threads, the whole dense, complicated structure of the place resolving at altitude into something that looked, from above, like it was built to work together. Amara leaned against the window and looked out at all of it. She did not feel triumphant. Triumph would have been the wrong feeling, because what had happened was not a victory in the way that word usually meant. It was a correction, long, difficult, still incomplete, and likely to require sustained attention for years. The 26 people who had been removed from first-class cabins before her, each with a name and a destination and a valid boarding pass and a story she would never fully know, were not vindicated by what she had built in response. They could not be fully vindicated. What she had built was, at best, the reason it had become harder for the next person to be treated the same way. Harder, not impossible. There is always more work on the other side of the work you finished. That was not nothing. She had decided a long time ago that not nothing was enough reason to keep going. The passenger in the aisle seat, an older man, gray-haired, with the comfortable, settled ease of someone who had taken many flights and still found the view worth noticing, looked past her at the window. Something about looking down from up here, he said quietly. Not quite to her, not quite to himself. Yes, Amara said. He nodded, content with that, and returned quietly to his book. Below them, the last edge of Chicago dissolved into open country, the land spreading flat and continuous in every direction, and the plane moved through the air with the steady, unhurried certainty of something built to do exactly this, to lift people from one place and carry them toward another, through air that belonged to no one and was therefore available to everyone, at every altitude, without condition. She opened her notebook slowly to a blank page. She picked up her pen and began to write. If they had known who she really was, would they have treated her differently? Or does that say everything about who they are? Hit like and subscribe. We tell stories that don't let you look away.